Welcome to the Supply Chain Dialogues, Season 4, Episode 3. I'm Daniel Helmig, and I'm here with AI-mee, my AI co-host who's been helping me dig through all the data for this series. Last episode, we explored the standards paradox, how more measurement and reporting can actually mean less action. Today, we're diving into something even more interesting and alarming.
That's right. Today, we're examining Hypothesis 2 from your doctoral research, which revealed perhaps the most counterintuitive finding of the entire study. We discovered that traditional cost-benefit analysis, the supposed gold standard of rational business decision-making, actually kills climate action.
The numbers are staggering. We found a correlation coefficient of minus 0.490, statistically significant, at p less than 0.001. In plain English, that means companies conducting traditional cost-benefit analyses are significantly less likely to implement supply chain changes for emission reduction.
It's worth emphasizing just how strong this relationship is. With an R-squared of 0.279, traditional economic assessment explains nearly 28% of the variance in companies' decisions about greenhouse gas reduction practices. That's a substantial effect size that suggests economic evaluation frameworks are one of the primary barriers to climate action.
What makes this finding so troubling is that we're talking about economically rational companies. These aren't climate deniers or companies that don't care about sustainability. These are organizations doing exactly what business schools teach, conducting thorough financial analyses before making investment decisions. And that's precisely what's stopping them from taking climate action.
Let's break down what the research actually discovered. The study examined 248 German discrete manufacturing companies, controlling for company size, industry sector, and geographic distribution. The core finding challenges everything we assume about economic rationality in sustainability.
The statistical analysis failed to reject the null hypothesis, which stated that German discrete manufacturing companies are not influenced by perceived economic implications of supply chain changes to reduce Scope 3 emissions. This is the academic way of saying that companies are influenced by economic implications, just not in the way we'd expect.
Exactly. The strong negative relationship demonstrates that the more thoroughly companies evaluate sustainability investments using traditional financial frameworks, the less likely they are to proceed. This isn't about companies being short-sighted or irrational. It's about evaluation frameworks being fundamentally misaligned with the nature of sustainability investments.
The research revealed something fascinating about implementation costs specifically. Whilst overall economic assessment showed the strong negative correlation, consideration of specific implementation costs actually showed a modest positive relationship at beta equaling 0.188.
That tells us something crucial about the mechanics of this barrier. Companies can handle knowing what something will cost. That's manageable information. But when they put sustainability investments through the full machinery of cost-benefit analysis, comparing them to other investment opportunities using standard financial metrics, the sustainability projects systematically lose.
It's like forcing a marathon runner to compete in a sprint. The evaluation framework is designed for one type of investment, short-term, predictable returns, but we're asking it to assess something completely different. Long-term, uncertain, but potentially transformational investments.
The research suggests this creates what we might call systematic bias in evaluation methodology. Traditional cost-benefit analysis applies inappropriate discount rates to future benefits, fails to capture non-financial advantages, and overemphasizes short-term costs relative to long-term gains.
And this isn't just academic theory. The research found that this negative relationship persists across different company sizes, industry sectors, and geographic distributions. It's a fundamental structural problem, not just a training issue or a knowledge gap.
One of the most striking findings was what the research terms the discrete manufacturing paradox. Larger organizations with greater resources actually encounter more significant barriers to implementation than their smaller counterparts.
The moderation analysis revealed an interaction effect between company size and economic assessment effectiveness of a beta equaling negative 0.185, significant at p0.0052. This means that as company size increases, the negative relationship between economic evaluation and implementation becomes even stronger.
This completely contradicts conventional wisdom about economies of scale and sustainability. We'd expect larger companies to be better positioned for sustainability transformation. They have more resources, more sophisticated finance teams, better access to capital. But the opposite is true.
The research identifies several factors contributing to this paradox. First, increased bureaucracy. Larger organizations have more complex approval processes and financial governance structures, creating additional layers of economic assessment that impede implementation.
Then there's shareholder pressure. Larger companies face more intense scrutiny from financial markets, which typically focus on quarterly earnings rather than long-term sustainability investments. This creates pressure to use evaluation frameworks that favor short-term financial returns.
The complexity of global supply networks also plays a role. Larger companies manage more complex supply chains, making transformation more challenging and skewing cost-benefit analyses against comprehensive changes. When you're evaluating switching 500 suppliers versus switching 5, the complexity and costs appear overwhelming.
Perhaps most importantly, there's what the research calls metric misalignment. Larger organizations rely more heavily on standardized financial metrics that systematically fail to capture the full value of sustainability benefits. They're trapped by their own sophistication.
I think this reveals something profound about organizational theory. We assume that more resources and more sophisticated processes lead to better outcomes. But in sustainability, sophistication in traditional financial analysis becomes a barrier rather than an advantage.
The research found this paradox persists even when controlling for industry type and geographic distribution. It's not about particular sectors or regions. It's about how organizational complexity amplifies the barriers created by traditional economic evaluation frameworks.
Let's get practical about what this means. Amy, can you walk us through how this plays out in a real company's decision-making process?
Certainly. Imagine a large automotive manufacturer considering switching to renewable energy suppliers across their global operations. The sustainability team identifies potential emission reductions of 30%, which would significantly advance their net zero targets. But when this proposal hits the traditional financial evaluation process, several things happen. First, the upfront costs are immediate and quantifiable. New contracts, potentially higher energy costs, transition expenses. These get weighted heavily in the analysis. Meanwhile, the benefits are long-term and harder to quantify. Reduced regulatory risk, enhanced brand value, employee engagement, future carbon tax avoidance. These either get excluded from the analysis or discounted so heavily they become insignificant.
The analysis also compares this investment to alternatives using standard financial metrics. A factory expansion might offer a 15% IRR, the internal rate of return over 3 years. The renewable energy switch might prevent €10 million in carbon taxes over 10 years, but when discounted at traditional rates, it looks financially inferior.
The research suggests this creates what economists call market failure in capital allocation. Companies are making individually rational decisions that are collectively irrational from a societal and even long-term business perspective.
What's particularly insidious is that this process feels rigorous and scientific. Finance teams aren't trying to block sustainability. They're applying best practice evaluation methods. The problem is that these methods are fundamentally unsuited to sustainability investments.
The research found this effect is stronger in larger companies, partly because they have more sophisticated finance functions. A small company might make an intuitive decision. This feels right for our future. A large company puts it through extensive financial modeling that systematically undervalues environmental benefits.
And this explains why we see the correlation between company size and the strength of the negative relationship. It's not that larger companies care less about sustainability, it's that their evaluation processes are more systematically biased against it.
The research also revealed that this barrier exists regardless of industry sector. Whether we're talking about automotive, electronics, or mechanical engineering, the fundamental tension between traditional financial evaluation and sustainability investment remains constant.
This research has as well implications for how we think about the triple bottom line framework.
Absolutely. The triple bottom line, profit, planet, people, was supposed to provide a balanced framework for corporate decision making. But the research reveals that in practice, the profit dimension systematically dominates the other two.
The strong negative relationship between economic assessment and emission reduction implementation suggests that current frameworks fail to effectively balance economic, environmental, and social dimensions. When push comes to shove, traditional profit metrics win.
This isn't because companies don't want to consider environmental and social factors. It's because the evaluation tools they use are structurally biased toward short-term financial returns. The research suggests we need what it calls modified evaluation frameworks that better account for long-term environmental benefits.
But what would these look like in practice? The research points to several approaches. Internal carbon pricing, where companies assign a cost to carbon emissions and factor this into investment decisions. Environmental profit and loss accounting, where ecological impacts are monetized for economic evaluation.
There's also the concept of total cost of ownership models, including environmental impacts. Instead of just comparing upfront costs, companies would evaluate the full life cycle costs, including environmental externalities, regulatory risks, and stakeholder impacts.
But here's the challenge. How do we actually change evaluation frameworks that are deeply embedded in corporate governance, regulatory requirements, and shareholder expectations?
The research suggests this requires systematic revision of evaluation methodologies, organizational processes, and approaches to implementing TBL principles in practice. It's not about tweaking existing frameworks, it's about fundamental restructuring.
Let's talk solutions. Based on the research findings, what should companies actually do differently?
The research recommends several practical approaches. First, companies should develop what it calls extended business cases that include carbon pricing assumptions, regulatory change scenarios, and stakeholder value creation, rather than just traditional financial metrics.
This means when evaluating a supplier switch, don't just compare current costs. Factor in potential carbon taxes, regulatory compliance costs, reputational benefits, and employee engagement impacts. Suddenly, the more expensive sustainable supplier becomes the obviously better choice.
The research also suggests implementing more agile decision-making structures for sustainability initiatives. Create dedicated transformation teams with decision-making authority and ring-fenced budgets that don't have to compete directly with traditional investment opportunities.
I love this idea of sustainability venture funds, where the CSO can approve investments up to a certain threshold without putting them through the normal financial approval process. It recognizes that sustainability investments operate under different risk-return profiles.
For larger companies facing the discrete manufacturing paradox, the research recommends decentralized decision-making for smaller-scale sustainability initiatives to reduce bureaucratic friction whilst maintaining overall strategic alignment.
This makes sense. Set clear emission reduction targets centrally, but give business units freedom to achieve them however they want. Stop trying to standardize everything. Allow experimentation and learn from what works.
The research also emphasizes the importance of modified incentive systems that incorporate environmental and social performance alongside traditional financial metrics. If you only measure and reward financial performance, that's what you'll get.
And there's a regulatory dimension too. The research suggests policymakers should consider creating financial incentives or changing boundary conditions that help offset the disadvantages that sustainability initiatives face in conventional economic evaluations.
This could include carbon pricing mechanisms, tax incentives for long-term sustainability investments, or regulatory requirements that force companies to account for environmental externalities in their financial planning. And I know that you are working on changed gap frameworks and net present value calculations, which would make emission reduction investments the natural thing to do for CFOs. But you will cover this in your book, right?
Yep, I will have chapters on updated financial theory taking hopefully emission reduction investments to a never heard level and calculation examples to prove it. Not based on touchy-feely criteria, but hard financial frameworks that make every financial practitioner jump because it is the prudent thing to do. But back to the context of this podcast, the fundamental insight is that this isn't just about better tools or training. It's about recognizing that traditional economic evaluation frameworks are systematically misaligned with the requirements of sustainability transformation. Now, as we slowly wrap up, let's think about the broader implications. What does this research tell us about the challenge of achieving net zero by 2040?
The findings suggest that one of the biggest barriers to climate action isn't technical or even financial in the absolute sense. It's methodological. We're using evaluation frameworks designed for the industrial age to assess investments for the climate age.
The research reveals that companies with traditional cost-benefit analysis are significantly less likely to implement supply chain changes for emission reduction. But this isn't because sustainability investments are inherently unprofitable. It's because our evaluation methods are biased against them.
This has profound implications for policy. Simply mandating emission reductions or improving reporting standards won't be sufficient if companies' internal decision-making processes systematically reject sustainability investments.
Ultimately, this research challenges us to rethink what we mean by economic rationality in the context of climate change. Being economically rational today might mean accepting short-term costs to avoid catastrophic long-term risks.
The traditional cost-benefit frameworks that served us well in stable environments may be fundamentally inadequate for navigating the transition to net zero. We need evaluation methods that can handle uncertainty, long time horizons, and non-financial value creation.
Next episode, we'll explore the final piece of the puzzle: how policy and regulatory frameworks are failing to incentivize the very behaviors they're designed to encourage. We'll examine Hypothesis 3 and why current external policies and regulations show weak associations with actual supply chain implementation.
The pattern emerging across all three hypotheses suggests we need to fundamentally rethink how we approach corporate sustainability governance, from standards to economics to regulation.
Until then, remember, the economics of inaction aren't just about the costs of climate change, they're about the evaluation frameworks that systematically prevent us from taking effective action. We're not failing to invest in our climate future because it's too expensive. We're failing because we're measuring it wrong. This is Daniel Helmig for the Supply Chain Dialogues. Stay safe, be bold, and see you in 2 weeks. These are the Supply Chain Dialogues produced and copyrighted by Helmig Advisory in 2025.